Thank you very much for that introduction. I think the ayats that were just read are extremely appropriate for this occasion because I will probably end my talk with the Qur'anic metaphors of the Caliphate that featured in that reading. I have been asked to come and talk to you about an Islamic political institution that for almost a year now has been of central importance, I think, in the reporting on news from the Middle East, in particular in relation to civil war in Syria and the continuing unrest in Iraq. Of course, I'm referring here to the Caliphate that was proclaimed by an organization that is alternately referred to as ISIL and ISIS, IS, or Daesh in Arabic. And indeed, for 13 centuries, the Caliphate has been a rallying point for Muslims across the world. And while it was not formally abolished until 1924, its functioning as an effective institution of Islamic governments did not last more than a few centuries. However, its political significance long outlasted this administrative demise, and even today, the memory of the Caliphate remains a very important symbol of Muslim unity. So in today's talk, I'll give a brief overview of the historical development of the Caliphate, but I intend to focus in particular on its significance in the modern and contemporary Muslim world. Now, the origins of the Caliphate go back to an embryonic community of believers in the religious mission of the Prophet Muhammad. After the migration of the Prophet and his followers from their native Mecca to the more northern oasis that became later known as Medina, the community also recognized him as their leader in worldly affairs. And when the Prophet died, in 632 of the Common Era, his prophetic mission ended, but the community, of course, remained in need of some form of governance. And since Muhammad had left no will, and according to the majority of the followers also had not clearly a designated successor, whereas the Quran also offered very little concrete guidance on what to do next, a large segment of the community began to draw on an established Arab practice to have the tribal elders select a suitable senior figure as their leader. And in this instance, the choice fell on Abu Bakr, older individual who was not only one of the earliest converts to Islam, but also the late Prophet's father-in-law. Now, Abu Bakr was the first of the so-called rightly guided caliphs, Khulafa Rashidun, all of whom had been close companions of the Prophet during his lifetime. And while they have differing personalities, which have turned them also into sort of dramatic characters of both early Islamic chronicles and later histories, I think of interest is also that with their strikingly different dispositions, the earliest caliphs can also be said to embody different leadership types. If you look at Abu Bakr, he was a sort of an older person. He was regarded as what we would call now an interim pope during a very brief caliphate of only 2 years, and he was mainly concerned with consolidating the community and bringing back dissenting tribes which had seceded from the community after Muhammad's death. Now, the second caliph, the more martially qualified Umar ibn al-Khattab, was the first who began expanding the political influence and control of the Muslims outside the Arabian Peninsula, adding Jerusalem as the most prized possession to the Muslim realm, and also earning that honorific Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, which from then on became one of the caliphal styles. Now, Abu Bakr had died peacefully, but the 3 other rightly guided caliphs all met with a violent death. It's an indication that characterizing the period of the rightly guided caliphs as a golden age needs some qualification. You could say that Omar's murder could be regarded as the result of a random act of an unstable individual, but in the case of the third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, we can clearly speak of a political assassination. Uthman was a very divisive figure. On the one hand, he's credited with supervising the compilation of the Quran in the form that we know it, but on the other, he stood accused of nepotism, because he favored members of his own family, which belonged to the Meccan elite and had initially actually been opposed to Muhammad's mission. And the caliph's death at the hands of a mob of disaffected Muslims was by no means the end of all the troubles. Now, the fourth and last rightly guided caliph, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib, was pious and spiritual, but as a political quietist by inclination, he was what you could call kind of a reluctant leader. He found himself caught up in a very vicious struggle of succession between his own supporters, who insisted that Ali had been anointed by Muhammad as his heir from the start, and the clansmen of the murdered caliph, who suspected Ali of involvement in the plot against Uthman. And after years of armed altercations and very tense standoffs, also Ali was eventually assassinated. Now, in contrast to Abu Bakr and Umar, who were known as successors of the Messenger of God, so Khalifat Rasulullah, Uthman was one of the first who began to call himself God's vice-regent, Khalifatullah. And although that expression is indeed, as we heard, found in the Quran, there has no or little concrete political importance be attached to that term, because it is primarily a metaphor for humankind's role on earth as designated by God. But a change in terminology hints at a changing perception of the office of the caliph. Because initially it was executed in what you could consider rather parochial settings, but as the early Muslims began to fan out of the Arabian Peninsula and embarking on the conquest of the adjacent regions of North Africa, Fertile Crescent, Persia and beyond, they began to establish what was in effect an Arab empire. Now, after the assassination of Ali, the Shi'at Ali, the partisans of Ali, withdrew to form a separate Muslim community led by the descendants of Ali and referred to as Imams. And these people, of course, became known as the Shiites. But that opened the way for Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, the powerful governor at the time of Syria and the leader of Uthman's Umayyad clan, to claim the caliphate for himself. And he transferred the capital to his stronghold Damascus, and in effect became the first ruler of what we know as the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, conquest did not automatically mean conversion to Islam in that time. And the line between expansive warfare and spreading the religion by the sword was often blurred. Now, these expanding domains and the concomitant challenge of managing the relationship between the political center and the periphery required increasingly complex administrative structures. And as the caliphate evolved from its highly personalized beginnings into an institution, the designation vice-regents of God, Khalifatullah, became a permanent fixture under the Umayyads. Now, in later Islamic historiography, the Umayyads have always received a bad press, and they stood accused of letting their own mundane political interests prevail over the spread of Islam. And for that reason, they are considered to have functioned primarily as worldly kings, muluk, rather than caliphs. And early Muslim chronicles also have always elaborated on the depravity of individual Umayyad caliphs. Exceptions have been made for the founder, Muawiyah, and for Umar II. The latter was primarily considered worthy of the title caliph on account of his personal piety, but Muawiyah ibn Sufyan was admired for his hilm. And that quality could be described as a finesse politique, a subtlety and a cunning in the management of man and affairs, as Hugh Kennedy called it. It's a combination of shrewdness, moderation, and self-control. Now, that negative depiction of the Umayyads was initiated by historians working for the caliphs from the Abbasid dynasty that succeeded the Umayyads. That can be interpreted as a form of political expediency, or even explained as a religious necessity, in order to vindicate the uprising that had brought the ancestors of the patron caliphs to power. So what came to be known as the Abbasid Revolution grew out of a combination of Arab tribal rivalries and disaffection among growing numbers of non-Arab converts to Islam who felt discriminated under the Umayyads. And in 749, of course, the rebels then selected a descendant of the uncle of the Prophet, al-Abbas, as their leader, and that individual then took the throne as the first Abbasid caliph under the name as-Safa. Now, with their power base in what are now Iraq and Iran, the empire's political center shifted east as the Abbasids built a new capital on the Tigris, which they called Baghdad. The heyday of the Abbasids is also considered as a golden age, alongside the period of the rightly guided caliphs, but for different reasons. It lasted approximately from the 8th to the 10th centuries, when Baghdad became a center of learning, culture, and civilization. And caliphs such as Harun al-Rashid, who also features in the stories of the Arabian Night, founded the Beit al-Hikmah, a translation institute cum scholarly academy where a concerted effort was made to unlock the heritage of Greek antiquity and introduce that kind of learning to the Muslim world. Now, this continued under Harun al-Rashid's son, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who became the patron of a school of thought known as the Mu'tazila. And these theologians used Greek philosophy to give a rational underpinning to the tenets of Islam. But al-Ma'mun instituted an inquisition known as the Mihna, where he presided over the enforcement of very controversial articles of faith that flew in the face of what many Muslims actually believed, and that included the allegorical interpretation of the anthropomorphic, the human-like aspects of God, and of course the doctrine of a created Qur'an. Now, these dogmas eventually proved too divisive and were subsequently also revoked under the Caliph al-Mutawakkil. And from then on, the role of caliphs in religious matters changed substantially from that of the initiators to that of followers. And as it became increasingly challenging to run a centralized administration, also their political function became primarily symbolic. Caliphs can be said to have reigned, but they no longer governed. That brings us also back then to that debate whether caliphs are divine deputies of God or only successors of the prophet as a statesman. Aside from reflecting a shift from a decidedly human and modest administrative office to a political institution with the pretension of having some sort of an immediate sanction from the divine, that shift in terminology reflects a crucial stage in the evolution of the Caliphate that also informs subsequent political theorizing on Islamic governance by the ulama, the Islamic religious scholars. Now, this is an intellectual class that occupies an ambiguous place in Muslim society. On the one hand, they form the human resources pool for the many positions that need to be filled for an administrative, an efficient government administration. But simultaneously, they are also supposed to function as what we would nowadays call a watchdog. They have to make sure that the rulers indeed abide by the teachings of Islam and uphold Islamic learning. And this ambiguity is also reflected in the divine ordination they attribute to the Caliphate. But at the same time, they have to be keeping a critical eye on the office holders themselves. And the writings of the ulama reflect these intellectual struggles of dealing with an ever-growing gap between political ideal and historical reality. Debates on the separation of politics and religion are therefore not a modern phenomenon. And closely related to this is also the question of who are the true custodians of the message of Islam. And it has led to rivaling claims to religious authority between the caliphs and the ulama, who see themselves as the self-appointed heirs to the Prophet. Now, while the Abbasid Caliphate formally lasted until 1258, when the Mongols overran the last remnants of their empire and killed most of the remaining members of the dynasty, the effective political power of the Abbasids and the ability to enforce an effective administration over what had become an enormous empire stretching from the Atlantic to present-day India and deep into Central Asia had actually ended already many centuries earlier. And the tensions between a single caliphate, projected as the ideal way of uniting all the Muslims, and the political realities of contestations of political and religious authority became more and more pronounced in the so-called middle periods, the centuries that covered the period from the 10th to the 15th centuries of the Common Era. Caliph al-Mutawakkil, whom I mentioned earlier, is generally considered the last caliph of the Abbasid Golden Age. And outside the religious domain, the end of his rule also heralded the Abbasids' increasing dependency on Turkish tribes for exercising their military might and the increasing political importance of these non-Arab mercenary leaders have actually grown ever since. So that was a situation in the political center, but effective political control of the caliphs based in Baghdad over Islam's possessions in the far west had actually disappeared long before that. Because as early as 756 of the Common Era, a survivor of the massacre against the Umayyads had established himself in Muslim Spain, in Al-Andalus, as the emir of Cordoba. And in 929, his descendant and namesake Abdurrahman III actually proclaimed himself caliph. Now, although his political success as a caliph was primarily undergirded by his military qualities, Abdurrahman consolidated his hold on power by giving it legitimacy through the restoration of his lineage as the rightful caliphs. And claiming this office and dignity obviously added also prestige to his status as a ruler, but also proved a very useful aid in suppressing fitna, civil strife or political chaos that was threatening Muslim Spain because of the rise of yet another contender to the caliphate that had sprung up in North Africa. And that's a millenarian movement known as the Fatimids. Its leader, Abdallah al-Mahdi, had been proclaimed Imam Caliph 20 years before. And what makes, of course, the Fatimid caliphs exceptional is that they are Ismailis. So, originally, an offshoot from the Shia strand of Islam, except that they separate from the Ithna Asharis in terms of how many imams they recognize. Now, with present-day Tunisia as their starting point, the Fatimid operations were directed both west and eastwards, targeting the Maghreb, Muslim Spain, and after briefly considering Yemen as their base of operations, they eventually concentrated on taking control of Egypt. So, at the beginning of the 10th century, the Muslim world witnesses the existence of three rivaling caliphates. You have the Abbasids in the east, the Umayyads of Cordoba in the west, and then you have the Fatimids controlling North Africa, Egypt, and the Levant. Now, the Umayyads of Cordoba lasted only until 1031. And when Al-Andalus, Spain, began to fragment into separate emirates and sultanates, that was basically the end of the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba. They would sort of languish on till 1492, when the Reconquista was completed by returning Christian invaders into Spain. So by the start of the modern era, Islam is basically wiped out of southwestern Europe. The Fatimid Caliphate fell, well, roughly a century and a bit later, when Egypt and Syria were occupied by the so-called Ayyubid sultans. And the most famous of them is, of course, Salah ad-Din. We know him as Saladin in the European accounts of the Crusades. Now, the Ayyubids were ethnic Kurds. And although they had sworn formal allegiance to the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, they operated with full political autonomy. And as such, also the Ayyubids form another instance of the growing political power of non-Arab Muslims. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the Abbasid Caliphate collapsed in 1258 under the onslaught of the Mongols, who ransacked Baghdad and killed the caliph and most of his relatives. However, 3 years after the demise of the Abbasid Caliphate, a new Turkish, go back for a moment, ruler in Egypt named Baybars al-Bundukdari, who had taken over from the Ayyubids, set up a descendant of the Abbasid dynasty as the Caliph al-Mustansir in Cairo. And again, the reason was to give legitimacy to the Mamluk dynasties that would control Egypt for the next 250 years. So this token Abbasid Caliphate was maintained by successive Mamluk sultans until the conquest of Egypt by the Ottomans at the beginning of the 16th century. Now, many historical accounts record the Ottoman sultans as the next incumbents of the caliphate, but how this exactly came to be is generally glossed over. Although Sultan Yavuz Selim the Grim, did put to death the last Mamluk sultan, he let the puppet caliph be. He only made him abdicate and instruct the sharifs of Mecca to hand over the regalia of his office, the prophet's mantle and his sword, to the Ottoman sultans. But there was no explicit claim by Selim to the caliphate himself. For that, actually, you have to wait until the Ottoman-Russian Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca of 1774. And that took place during the reign of Abdul Hamid I. Until that time, we have no documentary evidence that the Ottoman sultans ever used actively the title Caliph of the Muslims. Now, this change to take on that title must be seen as a compensation for the Ottoman loss of real power by appealing to spiritual authority rather than real political control over the wider Muslim community. But it is not until the 19th century that the caliphate is again turned into a political tool, as the Muslim world is increasingly confronted with the challenge of growing Western interferences and ever more invasive European interventions in the form of colonialism and imperialism, and the accompanying phenomenon of modernity. Now, what I hope to show in the rest of the talk, when I concentrate on the modern and contemporary period, is how this idea of the caliphate retains purchase among Muslims, because the caliphate is endowed with a lot of symbolic capital. That's a term introduced by a French philosopher and sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. But modern and postmodern campaigners for the caliphate are also motivated by a normative aspect that is supposed to shape Islamic political practice. And that is the doctrine of a single leader of the Muslim community, or the Ummah. It has been a constant in Sunni orthodoxy, and it can be traced to a text on political Islam by one of the most important classical theorists, namely al-Mawardi's al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya. So what I will try to do in the remainder of the talk is to, first of all, I will talk about claims to the caliphate by the Ottoman sultans in the context of their pan-Islamist policies. Then I will have a look at some other contenders that begin making rivaling claims to the office as the Ottoman Empire further weakens. I'll say a few more things about attitudes of Muslims outside the historical Ottoman sphere of influence, namely in British India and in the Netherlands East Indies, about the caliphate. And then I will move to the rapid succession of events in the wake of the First World War, leading to the abolition of the caliphate. And in that context, I must also pay attention to the impact of Ali al-Raziq's book on Islam and the Foundations of Governance, which builds on the premise that nothing in Islamic teachings prescribes the need for a caliphate. And after that, we move forward a few decades to talk about the caliphal utopia that has been theorized by Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani, the founder and chief ideologue of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And to my mind, the proclamations of the caliphate by the Taliban in 1996 and by ISIS in 2014 are also examples of such utopian agendas. And then finally, I shift from historical realities to examining the recent use of the idea of the caliphate in literature, and I will end with revisiting the Qur'anic notions of caliph in the Quran as used also by contemporary Muslim intellectuals, and how that has led to radically different interpretations in terms of both symbolism and normativity. Now, when we talk about Pan-Islamism and the Ottoman Sultan Caliph, that is closely tied up with the change in the character of the European expansion in Asia and Africa on the back of the Industrial Revolution. The projects of early modern colonization are then turned into much more invasive imperialist designs, and British, French, and Dutch switch from monopolizing trade networks to the occupation of territory, establishing plantations, and moving into the mining of mineral resources. And thus they effectively start claiming sovereignty, leading to the introduction of the concomitant political administrative systems. Now, the first attempts of colonized Muslim populations to resist this European imperialism with an appeal to their shared religion date back to the 1860s, first coming from India and Central Asia, but they increase in the 1870s, when young Ottomans such as Namik Pasha began talking about the importance of Islamic unity. But what comes to be referred to as Pan-Islamism gains real traction in the 1880s. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani adopts this cause to further his own political ambitions, and he concentrates on cultivating the interest of the then ruling Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And the Sultan saw this co-optation as an opportunity to reinvent himself politically as an absolute ruler, but now in the name of Islam, after a brief, but in his eyes, a disastrous constitutional period with which the Ottoman Empire had experimented in the middle of the 19th century. So Pan-Islamism must therefore not only be seen as an Ottoman initiative per se, and Abdul Hamid's adoption of the role as caliph was actually more reactive than proactive. But still, the caliphate appeared to offer an effective rallying point for harnessing Muslim solidarity. Now, this pan-Islamist and Ottoman caliphal posturing was a reason of concern for the colonial administrations both in British India, in the Netherlands East Indies, while its political potential was actually very much valued by the German Kaiser in building alliances for the upcoming show of force among the great powers during the First World War. And in her research on Pan-Islamism and the figure of al-Afghani, Nikki Keddy highlights two aspects that actually demonstrate the hybridity of the use of the Caliphate for pan-Islamic purposes. On the one hand, inspired by the Mahdi uprising in the Sudan, al-Afghani emphasized the messianic dimensions of the Caliphate, which evinces indeed that symbolic capital I talked about earlier. And al-Afghani also drew parallels with the role of Abu Muslim in the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate, and began actually presenting himself as such a charismatic figure, not so much behind, but maybe next to the Caliph. Pan-Islamism is also distinctly modern in the sense that it can function as a form of religious nationalism, revolving around a shared religion rather than territorial belonging or ethno-linguistic affiliations. And these religious nationalistic tendencies are also found in the ideas on the caliphate of another Muslim reformist, Rashid Rida. Now, his best-known work on the subject of the caliphate is entitled The Caliphate and the Supreme Imamate. But the evolution of his writings on that subject show the same combination of idealism and pragmatism, some would call it opportunism, as you find in al-Afghani. And what you see then is that as the fortunes of the Ottoman Empire diminish, Rida starts catering to the possibility of a substitute, a mainly spiritual Arab caliphate, emphasizing powerful symbolic aspects, including Qurayshid descent of the incumbent and Mecca as the seat for that alternative caliphate. And that brings us to rivaling claims to the caliphate. And it's not surprising that when it became increasingly clear that the Ottoman Empire was not just the sick man of Europe, but terminally ill, that other Muslim rulers who were technically under Ottoman suzerainty began harboring ambitions of their own. The first to do so were the rulers of Egypt, and in fact, as early as the 1890s, al-Afghani had been playing a double game, grooming not only Sultan Abdul Hamid, but also putting out feelers to the Khedive, the viceroy of Egypt, Abbas Hilmi II, who had sort of been hinting at an interest in becoming the caliph as the Ottoman Empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. And similar ambitions were later entertained by Hussein Kamil. Now, the First World War and the immediate aftermath blew this power game full in the open as another claimant entered the contest. And that was the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, who of course is the descendant not just from the Quraysh, but from the house of Hashim. And that gave him the perfect pedigree to claim the caliphate. So that is why his name and even those of his predecessors had already been starting to circulate among earlier Arab nationalists and proponents of a combination of pan-Islamist and pan-Arab ideologies. You have to think about figures like Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, while individuals such as the aristocrat Wilfred Blunt tried to mobilize British support for that idea. Now, as the figurehead of the British coordinated Arab revolt against the Ottomans in the course of the First World War, Sharif Hussein began seeing the caliphate as his political reward, to which he felt entitled. However, the wider Muslim world had not yet given up on the Turks. Because elsewhere too, the caliphate's symbolic capital and the normative idea of a single leader were embraced by Muslim activists against non-Muslim foreign rule. but there appeared to be a preference for either retaining the Ottoman caliphs in Istanbul or maybe alternatively a spiritual caliphate in Mecca. But there was very little sympathy or support for the person of Sharif Hussein in either South or Southeast Asia. In British India, you had a relatively short-lived Caliphate movement which exhibited the same hybridity as 19th century Pan-Islamism in the Middle East, combining not only this romantic symbolism with a grounding in orthodox Sunni learning, also to the Indian Muslims supporting the caliphate made good political sense. However, the movement faced a real challenge because of, first of all, the anti-Ottoman and anti-Turkish sentiments among the British rulers in British India, rivalries among the high-profile political and intellectual Muslim figures trying to use the Khilafat movement for their own interests, and these include the Aga Khan, Jinnah, Sayyid Amir Ali, and Abu Qasim Azam. Further east, for the Muslims in Southeast Asia, the Ottoman Caliph Sultan had always been a kind of a distant, almost mythical figure, usually referred to as the Raja Rum, or the King of Rum. And in some instances, the Sultan was even confused with the Sharif of Mecca. However, there is documentary evidence from the 17th century that there existed a naval alliance between the Sultanate of Aceh in Sumatra and Indonesia and the Ottomans. And also during the bloody war with the Dutch, the Acehnese in northern Sumatra appealed to Istanbul for help. So when the Ottoman Sultan began playing up his caliphal credentials as part of his pan-Islamic policy, more Muslims in Southeast Asia began to look to Istanbul for the protection of their interests. And in first instance, these were mainly the expatriate Muslim communities who appealed to Ottoman consuls for help against the discriminatory and repressive regulations they faced. In particular in the Dutch East Indies, where they constituted a separate colonial administrative category called Vreemde Oosterlingen, alien Orientals. The interest among the Indies' indigenous Muslim population was only galvanized when the post-war caliphate crisis was already in full swing. And by that time, modernist Muslims became organized in Indonesia in two mass organizations, the Sarekat Islam and the Muhammadiyah. And interestingly, among these Muslim modernists in the Sarekat Islam and the Muhammadiyah, there appeared to have been more sympathy for Turkish nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal, the later Atatürk, while the growing rivalry between Istanbul and Mecca over the caliphate was watched with trepidation. In fact, Indonesian sentiments were distinctly against the figure of the Sharif Hussein, who was seen as a stooge of European colonial interests and only interested in robbing visiting pilgrims. Now, Sharif Hussein's own lobbying and campaigning for the office of caliph were greatly hampered by post-war developments. First of all, there were the uncertainties as to what would happen to what remained of the Ottoman Empire as Turkish nationalists and the Sultan vied for power. There was also growing British hesitation towards continued backing of the House of Hashim as the earmarked rulers of the Arab world. And finally, there is the re-emergence of the Wahhabi threat under the new Saudi ruler Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Now, the new Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VI Wahiduddin, his attitude towards the Allied powers had been one of appeasement, while Mustafa Kemal Atatürk advocated a much more defiant stance. And after Mehmed signed the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, the two camps, the Sublime Porte and the Turkish nationalists, were set on a collision course. And 2 years later, Mustafa Kemal reacted. And he ousted Mehmed VI as sultan and proclaimed a republic. However, the caliphate was retained, and the sultan's cousin Abdul-Majid was appointed as the new caliph. Now, in real terms, this had, of course, very little political significance, but it did appear to be a concession to these calls for a spiritual caliphate that continued to issue from many quarters of the Muslim world, once again affirming the symbolic force the office still held to the Muslims. But 2 years later, Mustafa Kemal felt confident enough to also abolish the caliphate, thus leaving the Muslim world for the first time in 13 centuries without even a symbolic figurehead. Now, even with the Ottoman caliph gone, Sharif Hussein's desperate attempts to prop up his own declining political influence by claiming the caliphate came to naught, and there are several reasons for that. First of all, Hussein failed in his overtures to the Turkish nationalists during the Lausanne Conference of 1923 to receive their endorsement for taking the caliphate. Secondly, the British were much too preoccupied with their dealings with France and Turkey in carving up the Middle East to pay much attention anymore to the Sharif. And finally, when hosting the deposed caliph Mehmed VI, Hussein was unable to convince him to transfer the office of caliph to himself. So in the end, Hussein was only left with the support of his son Abdullah, the king of Transjordan, while his other son Faisal was much too busy consolidating his transfer as king from Syria to Iraq. And when Atatürk abolished the caliphate on 3 March 1924, Hussein was actually in Transjordan, from where he then decided to proclaim himself caliph before traveling back to Mecca. There, the dignitaries from his native Hijaz region were actually the only ones who were recognizing his caliphate. And eventually, his stay in Mecca was cut short too, as he had to flee ahead of the arrival of the advancing Saudi troops. However, that still did not mean that Pan-Islamists had entirely given up on the prospect of reviving the caliphate. 2 other contenders were now pushed into the limelight. The king of Egypt, Fuad I, and the man who had succeeded in capturing Mecca and Medina, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Now, as a result of this rivalry, in 1925, the Muslim world became divided between supporters of the Egyptian monarch, who were trying to push through his elections at a conference in Cairo, and an alternative bloc favoring a caliphate in Mecca. And this included influential figures such as Rashid Rida, who was becoming increasingly charmed by the successes of this energetic warlord from Central Arabia, and for that reason Ibn Saud felt confident enough to convene a rivaling Muslim World Congress in Mecca. That split within the Ummah reached as far as the Netherlands East Indies, where no less than 5 all-Islam conferences were held between 1922 and 1926. By 1925, Indonesia's modern Muslim organizations had become very enthusiastic about the Saudi victories, while the traditionalists in Indonesia continued to side with the Sharif of Mecca. There was very little appetite there for an Egyptian caliph, and some secular nationalists actually tried to push Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to accept the caliphate. But in the midst of all this confusion, both these initiatives actually to restore the caliphate quickly ran out of steam. And the Muslim world had now to come to terms with a completely reconfigured Middle East. So I suggest that the failures of these alternative Arab caliphal ambitions must be attributed to the unease these rivalries created between proponents of a caliphate who were torn between the power of the institution as a symbol, but also this haunting prospect of fitna. And that's a violation, of course, of normative Islam as interpreted by Sunni orthodoxy. It's against that same background that we have to consider the publication of a political tract in that watershed year of 1925 by Ali al-Raziq, an Egyptian scholar at Al-Azhar from a family with links to Egypt's liberal constitutional party and who himself had been influenced by Muhammad Abdu. His book, Islam and the Foundations of Political Power, Islam wa Usul al-Hukm, was very influential and divisive. If you paraphrase it in briefest of terms, al-Raziq insists that neither the Quran nor the Sunnah of the Prophet present any imperative for a particular political model to govern the Muslim community, let alone something as specific as the Caliphate. And he also rejects the interference of the Caliphate, or the inference of the Caliphate as an article of faith on the basis of ijma, or the consensus of the scholars. For al-Raziq, the Caliphate is a historical contingency that came about through coercion at the hands of its office holders. And according to al-Raziq, coercion and violence have actually been the hallmark of political power ever since. From the Umayyads all the way to Mehmed VI, caliphs have used force to build an empire and to hold on to power until the very end. Now, aside from ordinary Muslims suffering constant repression at the hands of their rulers, another casualty of this state of affairs was the development of political science in the Muslim world. Caliphs, sultans, and other rulers, together with the religious establishment, made every effort to prevent free inquiry into political philosophy and theory. If this had been allowed, says al-Raziq, then social, political, historical research would have shown that the very vagueness and the obscurities and uncertainties surrounding the system of power during the days of Muhammad are actually reflective of the fact that the authority of prophethood is of an entirely different order than that of a political ruler. A prophet's hold over people is moral and spiritual, appealing to the deepest sensibilities of the people it is addressing. It's not coercive. And for this, he says, there is ample evidence, both in the Quran and the Sunnah. Not only can there be no compulsion in religion, al-Raziq also cites numerous instances where the Quran states that Muhammad is but a reminder and a warner, not an overseer, a keeper, or a guardian. So, thus, the central argument of that book is that Islam is a religion, not a state. Now, the fallout of that book was far-reaching, not least for the author himself, who was brought in front of a disciplinary tribunal, stripped of his status as an alim, and fired from Al-Azhar, ending his days in relative obscurity and self-imposed silence. Now, in his book, The Inevitable Caliphate, Reza Pankhurst placed down the significance of al-Raziq's book, which had indeed aroused great anger and was derided for being at odds with accepted orthodoxy. Now, this is due to the fixation of Pankhurst's own study on the normativity of a single leader for the Muslims. But I suggest that al-Raziq's refutation of the caliphates stands at the beginning of alternative ways of Islamic political thinking, both secular but also Islamist. Because some Islamists refuse to give up on the idea of the caliphate, entertainingly, increasingly utopian ideas. Now, one such example is Hizb ut-Tahrir, founded in Jordan in the 1950s by a religious scholar named Taqi ad-Din al-Nabhani. It has since spread worldwide. Nabhani doubles as the organization's leader and chief ideologue, and he has written a great deal and in great detail about Hizb ut-Tahrir's objectives. If you strip it down to its bare essentials, Islam is presented as an alternative to the two secular ideologies that have achieved world domination in the 20th century, capitalism and socialism. And Islam is presented as a comprehensive and completely self-sufficient ideology of liberation for the Muslims. What sets Hizb ut-Tahrir apart from other Islamist organizations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, is the central place for the restoration of the Caliphate in its highly systematized ideology. According to Nabhani, an ideology, he uses the term mabda rather than ideologia. It consists of a doctrine offering a diagnostics of the human condition and a system, which is a prescription for the practical application of the doctrine. Now, in the face of competition from Arab nationalism and Pan-Arabism, as well as the surveillance and repression by state organization, most attention went actually to the first two stages of the implementation of this ideology. The analysis of the defects in the Muslim world, organizational capacity building, and the recruitment and training of cadres. But about 10 years into Hizb ut-Tahrir's existence, the third stage, restoring a caliphate, started to gain more prominence. The objective is not to restore a secularized caliphate like was the case under Abdul-Majid, the last Ottoman caliph, but rather a more abstract elaboration of what al-Nabhani saw as the overall intellectual emancipation of the Muslims. It meant reviving ijtihad in defiance of passivity, which in his view was encouraged by Sufism and also the materialism resulting from the West's cultural invasion. I'll do this then very quickly to move on to the final part of the talk. So there is a concept for a constitution for an Islamic state which is grounded on a few principles. Sharia, Islamic law, is the actual sovereign. And the caliphate is a religious obligation under Sharia. The caliph is then elected by the Ummah, and he is charged with interpreting the Sharia for practical purposes. Now, Hizb ut-Tahrir's activities have mainly remained an intellectual exercise. But some other utopian Islamists have decided to use force to implement their agendas for the restoration of a caliphate. And the most recent example is, of course, the Islamic State, an Islamic jihadi organization that also draws its ideological underpinnings from the restoration of the caliphate. It draws primarily on the ideas of this man, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, and his book, Millah Ibrahim, or the Leadership of Ibrahim. This book's narrative is millenarian in terms of its borrowings from the Quran and the Sunnah, but in terms of its symbolism, it also draws on select elements taken from the historical caliphates. And from within this mindset, al-Maqdisi offers a coherent, repetitive scenario consisting of 5 steps. There's first the migration or the hijrah, and that applies in equal measure to Abraham leaving Ur, Muhammad moving from Mecca to Medina, as ISIL fighters leaving their respective homelands. The next stage is building a community, which also includes this notion of Abraham's covenant with God that sets then in motion this whole narrative of the Abrahamic religions, continuing with Muhammad's Ummah in Medina, and then again taken up by IS and its predecessors to recruit followers in Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and then the wider world. Now, in al-Maqdisi's theory, the Qital al-Nikaya, that is fighting the idols, must be understood as extending beyond combating polytheists and Islamic heresies to include also challenging the existing political regimes in the Muslim world. And eventually, this must then lead to Qital al-Tamkin, which ISIS now sees as it effectuating that by actually occupying political power in the Syrian-Iraqi borderlands. And eventually, ideally, that of course should then culminate in a caliphate. Now, that combination of Islamic millenarianism and symbolism also figures very prominently in ISIS' own glossy magazine called Dabik. The name is taken from a locality on the borders of Syria and Turkey, mentioned in a hadith that prophesizes a decisive battle between Muslims and Christians, heralding the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims. It's associated with the notion of Armageddon or Malahim in the Islamic tradition. According to the ideology of al-Maqdisi, that basically announces the end of times. And they have one hadith they appeal to, which has this vision of the portents of the arrival of the hour. Especially that these sentences, the slave gives birth to her master and the shepherds of black camels start boasting and competing with each other in the construction of tall buildings. Some have seen that as an explanation for the taking of slaves by IS fighters. They say this is the vindication for that practice. And of course, developments in the Gulf, places like Dubai, sort of create this image that is presaged in that caliphate. So IS basically feels vindicated by this imagery that they're on the right track. You can see that also in the symbolism attached to when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was proclaimed as Caliph Ibrahim. He did that wearing the black garments of the Abbasids in the Nuri mosque of the Ayyubid Sultan that controlled at that time Mosul. So they actually tried to capitalize on that very imagery. Now, Abu Bakr's claim to the caliphate has actually been challenged by al-Maqdisi and also by al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, because they say it's an act of fitna, because actually there is already a caliph. Because in 1996, Mullah Omar was proclaimed Amir al-Mu'mineen. He didn't use the word caliph, but since Amir al-Mu'mineen is one of the honorifics of the caliph, the claim of al-Qaeda and people like al-Maqdisi is that what IS is doing is an act of fitna. Now, very quickly then, moving to the end of my talk, aside from all these political interpretations of the notion of the caliphate in its most distorted forms by IS, there is in the contemporary Muslim world a very different trend among intellectuals and also literary writers who have returned to the caliphate as what I call a literary trope, or that Qur'anic metaphor with which also the Quran readings of this evening started. One example of this is the debut novel of Yusuf Raja, an Egyptian writer, and it's called The Book of the Sultan's Seal. The Arabic original was released in the very week that Mubarak was deposed from power, and as a consequence, the book did not get much attention. But the publication of the English translation coincided in the fall with the rise of IS, and that led to new interest in the book. He uses the trope of a city tour, which you also find in books like James Joyce's Ulysses or Abdul Wahab Madeb's Talismanu, and Raja has organized his book around the protagonist's wanderings through Cairo's urban landscape and history. And he uses that as a setting for the main character's visitation by the spirit of the last Ottoman Sultan, Caliph Mehmed VI. That makes the Book of the Sultan's Seal not only interesting in relation to both historical and recent developments in the Muslim world, Raja's choice of the caliphate as a literary motif demonstrates that it is still endowed with sufficient symbolic capital to effectively feature in a postmodern Egyptian novel. And this is what one literary critic has even called a linguistic caliphate, which arguably brings us then back to the caliphate in the original text in the Quran. Because there, of course, we find a reference to the creation of a Khilafat Allah fil Ard, God's human vice-regency on earth. Now, this Quranic notion is, of course, entirely different from what I have been talking about so far. Let me remind you again that Al-Mawardi's manual for Islamic statecraft, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the section that deals with the Caliphate, cites from Surat Al-An'am, where it indeed says, "It is he who has appointed you viceroys in the earth." But Al-Mawardi quotes that line from the Quran to stress that this is not the kind of caliphate he and his fellow ulama are concerned with. However, a number of other contemporary Muslim intellectuals have drawn on this Quranic notion of caliphs and caliphate in order to develop an alternative conceptualization. And a seminal contribution to this discourse was made by Indonesia's leading Muslim intellectual of the 20th century, Nurcholish Madjid. As chairman of the largest Indonesian student organization in the late 60s and early 70s, Madjid became famous and notorious for this slogan, which is a bit reminiscent, I think, of al-Raziq's claim that Islam is not a religion, is a religion, but not a state. Because Madjid had this slogan, Islam, yes, Islamic parties, no. Now, in his later career, Madjid developed this into a coherent set of ideas that is at one and the same time a theology, an anthropology, a political theory, and an epistemology. Now, it's impossible for me to do justice to the complexity of these ideas in a few minutes, but what it boils down to is that for Madjid, the human condition consists of two dimensions. There is a vertical one between the individual and the transcendent, which he calls in Indonesianized Arabic, ukhrawi. And this constitutes the spiritual dimension of human existence, the domain of the eternal, the universal, and the sacred. Epistemologically, it's governed by the notion of fitra, the innate human capacity to believe, and it is expressed through taqwa, or God consciousness. But, he says, there's also a horizontal dimension to human life. He calls that dunyawi. And it interconnects humans in their temporal and secular existence with each other. And this domain, he says, is governed by that other human faculty, reason. Now, politics evidently belongs to the latter domain. And similar to al-Raziq, Nurcholish Madjid argues that sacralizing the idea of an Islamic state or caliphate is actually demeaning to religion. To put it even stronger, Madjid finds this equation of religion and politics sacrilegious because it violates the core Islamic doctrine of Tawheed. And for one commentator, that was reason to call Nurcholish Madjid a radical monotheist. Now, like al-Maqdisi, Madjid too appeals to the figure of Abraham, but with an entirely different objective. Because for Madjid, the notion of al-Hanafiya al-Samha, or the primordial monotheism represented by Abraham, is the starting point for human vice-regency, or kekhalifahan manusia in Indonesian. Followers of Nurcholish Madjid, such as the philosopher Budi Munawar Rahman and the political scientist Yuri Latif, have used this notion to argue for a theologie kekhalifahan, an engaged theology that favors the defense of Indonesia's pluralist state ideology of Pancasila against Islamists. It means a call for the emancipation of the poor along the lines of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. It makes a case for engaging in grassroots level development schemes, and this notion of human vice-regency on earth can also be used to address environmental issues. Yeah? Now, all this is, of course, very different from restoring the historical caliphate, but I think it's still reflective of the symbolic power and the normativity that can be attached to the notion of the caliphate as a metaphor for human responsibility. Thank you very much.
Salawat. If it's okay, we'll just break for prayers and then we'll have a Q&A session straight afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carool, for your excellent presentation. I have two, questions come observations. One is that there's no mention of the Sokoto Caliphate in your discourse, because I think that coexisted with the Ottomans, and that is part of the fraying of the caliphal domain, if you like. And the second one is, do you think the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood and the equivalent Jamaat Islami is an admission that the caliphal idea is no longer viable? They don't, of course, aspire to the caliphate, and it's just saying that now with the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, that is over. We need to look at something new.
Yeah, I think that is a fair observation, and I think that is also what I meant when I said the fallout of that book by Ali al-Raziq was twofold. It was taken by people favoring outright secular political regimes to say that, you know, they were right. But it also made people who did believe that religion had to feature somehow in politics, whether you want to call them Islamists or not, that is secondary, that indeed you had to look at alternatives. Indeed, the Muslim Brotherhood does not address the issue of the disappearance of the caliphate or the need to restore it. They look at entirely different formulas. And the same with Jamiat al-Islami, which, you know, got more opportunity than the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in the political process in Pakistan, because from the outset they decided, well, let's play by the rules of the democratic game, and found a political party and run in elections. The Muslim Brotherhood did not get that opportunity, and only much later in its history it tried to do that. So there was a clear choice there and then to a sort of adjust to the changing political landscape. There you sort of realized that not only was there this formal abolition of the caliphate, but also the Middle East had changed beyond recognition, say, between the Napoleonic invasion and the end of the First World War, when political structures that had been in place for centuries had basically vanished. So they had to adjust to that. But they wanted some kind of an Islamic referent in politics. But others indeed were not willing to give up. And that's why you get, after a few decades, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and even more recently, this IS phenomenon.
I've got two questions relating to the millenarian nature of the Daesh movement. There's the frequently quoted hadith which reports that after the era of the Khulafa Rashidun, there will be the era of kings, and then of the dictators, the Tawaghit, and then will come the age of the Mahdi. So the Daesh, are they awaiting some kind of Mahdi?
Yeah, they are.
And secondly, is there featured in any of their kind of rhetoric or discourse a notion of an apocalyptic confrontation with the Shia as part of their kind of millenarian vision?
Yes, I mean this whole notion, that's why they coined that magazine also, Dabek, which is a physical location, of course, very conveniently located within their sphere of influence on the borders with Turkey, and giving them sort of an opportunity that if they have any military victories in that vicinity, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, no pun intended. But yeah, IS is so difficult to grasp, I think, is because of the mixed signals it gives. It makes these appeals indeed to the very beginning of the Abrahamic narrative and all the symbolisms attached to it, whether it's from the Quran or the Sunnah. And at the same time, they are utterly postmodern in the way they present themselves. They're media savvy, the way they try to recruit. I don't know if you saw that last week there was a travel guide, basic guide to the Islamic State. Now, I was asked to comment on that, so I had to have a look at it, and there was something very strange. This was for a magazine that usually deals with, urban restaurants and stuff like that. So they were interested in the food part. And what struck me about that travel guide, they talked about where you could get cappuccinos, and if there was Starbucks in Mosul, and Cadbury, all the brand names. So it was clearly addressing the needs and the concerns of young urban Muslims, wherever they are. But they were very concerned. If I go to Syria and Iraq, can I get all this stuff? Halal food, which I had a sort of expected to be central to an IS travel, came as an afterthought. Like, oh yeah, and everything is halal. I was completely thrown off my bearings because I was sort of looking at with locations, sites to see. I'm sure they're going to take you to all the battlefields and interesting things. And then with food, I was waiting for it. Everything is halal and, you will not be contaminated with anything unpleasant. But it was about brand names. So in that sense, it's a very strange phenomenon. That makes it probably also so dangerous. Because it is not a sort of the spar. I mean, it is a sort of like school holiday type of jihad. Al-Qaeda, or the predecessor of Al-Qaeda, the Services Bureau, Maktab al-Khidamat of Azam and Bin Laden started out like that in the 80s. For young Saudis, you want to come in your summer holidays and fight the communists? Come over to Afghanistan. They kept them out of harm's way. You got a chance to take a picture with an AK-47. But for the rest, that was pretty Spartan. You staying in guerrilla camps. Now it caters to some, I call them gourmet jihadis, who live in a sort of a club med they're trying to present to these people. And that is very weird, I think, and also confusing because, there is the very calculated use of atrocities, at the same time catering to the potential recruiters that they can live in comfort, and then this archaic appeal to, Qur'anic and biblical imageries of end-of-time notions. That's quite bizarre, I think, for an organization like IS. And that's, I think, why we struggle to understand it and why it works.
I'm going to take things quite far back to the Umayyad period as a form of establishment of a kingship-based administration. Because before that, during the 4 early Khulafa, there wasn't a real administration, so to say, as a state. It was in formation during those years, and the Umayyads consolidated an administration, political administration, so to say. Once that was taken over by the Abbasids, it kind of solidified that concept of a political-based kinship-based administration. Then you see the whole kind of rolling and trading of that seat, that becoming a symbol, but underlying, propping up that symbol in administration, a political administration with a court, with a legal system, with representation of tribes, etc. It was that fell in the early 19th century. Once that fell, you then had the administration disappearing amongst the Muslims. So is the requirement at the moment for IS or any other such state or such ideology to establish a state, an actual administrative state, as a way of returning back to that lineage of a political administration justified or legitimized by religion, but irrelevant of that as a political state in terms of comparison to Chinese development of administrative states, to European establishment of administrative states? Or is it an ideology that has roots in faith and therefore they're establishing a faith? So it's ideology or methodology?
I think indeed in terms of state building, I see that as quite divorced from their ideology. They proclaim to be restoring a caliphate, but there is at the same time, and this comes back to what I said earlier about mixed signals, this is also an example of that, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of running a state, religion doesn't provide the answers. You can be as ideological and millenarian till you see blue in the face, but it doesn't keep the lights burning. And IS has found, and I think that's why they were successful over the past year, they were very careful to pay attention to the nuts and bolts, unlike Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is completely ideological, abstract, intellectual. I mean, they don't fill in anything of these blanks. IS talks indeed in the vernacular of, end of times and a caliphate, and it exploits the symbolisms. But once Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi steps off the pulpit, they get down to business and they make sure that salaries were paid, the oil fields were operational and things like that, even to the very cynical dimensions, like when we saw the destruction of the antiquities. They only destroyed a little bit. And for the rest, there is indications they're selling it on the art market. And the destruction was calculated to drive up the price. They created the impression there was virtually nothing left. But they have, according to archaeologists, stuff is surfacing all over the place, in the thousands. So, they're not ideological at all about that. And in that sense, well, the Umayyads were always, as I said, they had a bad press, but they had a bad press because the earliest chronicles were written already by the enemy, by the Abbasids, who had to make the Umayyads look bad to vindicate what was a coup d'etat, but also to illustrate the different demographics that was occurring. In the early conquests, I think the Arab tribes were still of such a tribal mindset that to be Arab was Muslim and to be Muslim was Arab. It was virtually impossible to convert. You had to get Mawali status as a Persian or a Syrian, adopted in an Arab tribe, and then you could convert. And also then there was practicalities, obviously. All the Muslims shared in the ghanima, the spoils of war. If you convert people, there's less for you. So in first instance, it was indeed expansion, taking control, but there was no immediate incentive to convert people. And as they conquered territory, there was maybe an incentive of the conquered people to join the Muslim community. And that can often have been very pragmatic considerations, career prospects, things like that. And they had to rely on the conquered people, because exactly for the thing that also plays now on a smaller scale in this time and age for IS, you have to run basically a state on a practical level. The Rashidun, the Umayyads, and the Abbasids had that problem. Byzantines and Persians knew how to do that. So that was their initial human resources pool. And I think from that point onwards, there was a realization that, you could sort of claim legitimacy and get prestige for your position as a ruler. But when it came to the nuts and bolts, the Muslim empire was in that sense not different from Byzantium or the Sasanian empire. And that had to be glossed over, of course, later on also in these texts when there was fragmentation and the practicalities already dictated that from Baghdad you couldn't run Cordoba or Samarkand or the Sindh province. These local rulers were virtually autonomous. The communications dictated these kind of situations. And the theorists had a similar approach to it. They start to look much more at, the caliph's role in upholding Islamic teachings, but they say very little in terms of what exactly the caliph is supposed to do, and in terms of job description, how he has to maintain that. Because the ulama like to have that for themselves.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the motivation for IS. What do you think motivates them? Is it power? Is it ideology? Is it what is it? Because they're very. It's like you say, the message seems quite confused at times.
You're asking the wrong person. No, I mean, I'm sort of talking myself out of a job here, but when you get these questions of why do Muslims radicalize, the question is wrong. You have to ask, why do young people radicalize? Because the people who now run after IS, if they had grown up in the 60s, they would have been wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt. And in the 70s, they would have been with the Bader-Meinhof-Gruppe or something like that. Historians of religion, like me, can tell you, well, the symbolism comes from this and that. But what makes these people tick? I was about to say, it's a bit of a bad example when you talk about suicide bombers. But what motivates people to make indeed the choice for very uncompromising ideologies, I think you have to ask forensic psychologists and psychiatrists in many instances. If I were able to explain why people join IS, I would need professional help. I think it's that is often, and that is the danger also, because if you ask too many historians of Islam about it, or only them, then indeed you create the image as if there is something inherent to Islam that causes that. While it's actually instrumental, it is because of the situation in a lot of Muslim countries. There's underlying political, socio-economic, and maybe to a degree cultural reasons why these things happen. But Islam is then instrumentalized by people for political gain. I mean, in that sense, the leadership of IS, which is very shadowy, it's almost like Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, we know he is apparently in charge, but he's been declared dead 3 or 4 times now. They are masters in political manipulation, and I think they know very well that nothing gets people worked up more than religion, more even than a political ideology, like whether it's communism or fascism. Because religion touches on what I said earlier, why, the authority of a prophet is different from a politician. It touches on people's deepest sensibilities. And Paul Tillich said, if you want to define a religion, you don't have to come up with complex theologies and a Godhead and the transcendent. He said, basically anything that touches on people's ultimate concerns, that's religion. So if you use that for political purposes, it becomes a very combustible mix.
Thank you very much. I've got a question, if that's okay. When a lot of what you've been talking about when it comes to the Khilafah is the Sunni world of Khilafah. Have you had a chance, or do you have a view as to how that compares to Wilayat al-Faqih in the understanding from the post-Iranian revolution, or Wilayat al-Ummah from Shaykh Muhammad Baqir Sadr, or other Shia models, and do you see there to be any compatibility between the two or competition between the two, or do you see any relationship that or analogy that can help make things make more sense?
In terms of, if you look at politics and religion, yes, Wilayat al-Faqih can also be instrumentalized in the same way as a caliphate can be. Obviously, it would be then just the Shia variant of that. So no, it's not a matter of compatibility. There is just now historically those two main traditions within the wider Muslim world, you have a Sunni and a Shia trajectory. And you can, yes, it did start out and as what I call a leadership issue. But as the communities go their separate ways and have a different idea of who the leader is, you know, the imam has certain qualities that were not attributed to a caliph. So the whole outlook of the Shia tradition is in that sense, from its inception, different from the Sunni trajectory. And it has filled in its political discourse also accordingly. But if you then take it to the present and how it is used in contemporary settings, whether it's an Islamic Republic of Iran or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it has its own specificities. But the danger is always that it is instrumentalized in the same manner. Does that answer everything? Because I thought there was like 3 things in your question.
Any final questions? Last question.
You talked about the ISIS and political manipulation and so on. That's so clever. Is that because of the people actually behind? I mean, one of the very important people behind the whole of ISIS is the Baathists, who are actually not only helping them militarily, but also in a way politically, to be, because they're so astute in that sense, rather than just being the ISIS themselves.
It's part of the explanation. Indeed, if you look at where IS has or had its appeal, because a lot of people became disenchanted quite quickly, definitely the Baath establishment was part of that. And there, of course, you have also a tremendous experience, not only of being in government from 1979 till early 2000. Before that, these people also had underground political experience, and they basically went back underground for another decade after 2003. Plus, they have their own client-patron networks, especially that figure Izzat Ibrahim, who was a sort of, you know, later, what was he? The Club of Spades, huh? In that deck of cards. He ran a smuggling network already in the time of during Saddam Hussein, and he continued to use that also when he sort of, well, basically offered his services to IS. And IS didn't, well, for a lot of people, came out of the blue maybe last summer, but it basically can be traced not only ideologically to this figure al-Maqdisi, who sort of talks about the Caliphate part of the narrative, but also to Zarqawi. Yeah, so it has actually a history of almost 10, 15 years of already operating in the shadows. And then maybe something else that has been alluded to in the writings on the rise of IS. It was a Baath component. It was indeed these Zarqawi militias that sort of had been entrenched among, you know, these tribal lands in Fallujah and across the border into Syria. But the final component is apparently also an Iraqi-Syrian variant of the Naqshbandi Sufi order. All this creates networks of people who were often not free to operate in the open, and yeah, they have what I call transferable skills, which can be used in these situations.
You know, you talked about the young people. They might have some psychological problems to go and join, but do you not think that maybe that they do not believe in what the media tells them to say what kind of people ISIS is? So therefore, they are going there with a different understanding of the whole situation, rather than being some mental problems for them.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not trying to say that everybody is pathological who is doing that. There is also a degree of naivete, because if they're sort of savvy enough to see that there's a sort of, you know, the devil incarnate image that they get from the Western media. These young people are smart enough to sort of see that, you know, that there is always this depiction of Islam and Muslims as something very dangerous and menacing. And they basically buy into that travel guide, Darbic. I mean, I don't know if you have seen it. You can download them from the internet. They are these strange mixes of a sort of a glamorization of what they're trying to achieve. And I did not call them utopian for nothing. I mean, utopian does not necessarily mean, peaceful and beautiful. It can also be quite, martial and a sort of a celebration of violence. But it does offer exactly that, what young people look for. It is an alternative lifestyle, as were the hippies and Che Guevara's, guerrillas and Castro in the 50s and 60s. It offered something less square than what your parents do. That's not pathological, that's part of growing up, but it can derail completely. The same as a lot of the hippies became complete spaceheads and never recovered from their LSD trips. This is some non-narcotic equivalent of that. And that's where the danger is. But it's not to say that everybody who joins, who tries to go there is from the outset mentally deranged. I mean, it's a spectrum anyway, right?
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there.
Thank
Salawat.
you.